So this is evolution and classification. So the Earth is actually 4.6 billion years old. So about 2 billion years ago, prokaryotic cells that could use oxygen invaded prokaryotic cells that couldn't. So basically allowing both of them to survive. One provided a home and the other one provided oxygen. So this is where we actually thought of the endosymbiotic theory, which where the modern day mitochondria and chloroplast actually had their own DNA, where the prokaryotic cells engulfed the eukaryotic cells. So Earth's age is actually measured by the geological time scale, and it's divided into 4 eras. Those eras divided into periods, and this is actually developed by studying rock layers and comparing them. So let's look at the fossil record. So we noticed that in the early 1700s as well as 1800s that we were kind of struggling to really understand and explain what fossils are. So fossils are any type of imprint or remains of an organism that's found in a rock. So philosophers actually suggested that these fossils just kind of grew in nature and just fell from the sky. But in 1667, Steno was the one that actually studied a large shark that had been caught by fishermen and noticed that their teeth represent some stony items. So he questioned how did these solid objects, such as these teeth, were found in rocks. So eventually he actually concluded that these horizontal layers or stratas were actually formed around these fossils. So he also realized that the younger layers of rocks were on the top and the older were towards the bottom. So this was actually helped determine the age of each of the fossils. So in a nutshell, fossils. Okay, so fossils are formed in sedimentary rocks. Okay, so sediments means multiple types of sediments or multiple types of stone or rocks that are contributed together using or combined together using pressure as well as age. So it also provided evidences for history of life. Okay, it showed how different groups changed over time. So if we look, okay, so we have this lake. Okay, unfortunately, the organism dies, goes down to the bottom. So it's being buried by sediment, which form new rocks, and basically that it preserves the remains till later to be discovered or studied. Okay, so fossils again help construct our history. Okay, there's 2 different ways to determine the age. You've got relative dating and absolute dating. So relative dating is where we actually kind of compare the age of the fossil compared to where we find it, comparing to the other fossils that we've found, okay, in comparison of its age. So the older fossils are deeper in the rock layers, the younger fossils are towards the top. So if we have, let's put these guys in order. Okay, so we have fossil A was found at the top, fossil B was the third, fossil C was the furthest down, and fossil D was between B and C. So let's age these guys, or let's perform relative dating and put these guys in order. Okay, so which fossil is the oldest? It should be C. What is our next one? It should be D. What's our next one? B and then A. Okay. So C, D, B, and A. Okay, so absolute dating. Absolute dating is where we actually determine the amount of carbon that's left in the fossil. Okay, so this is, we also recall this you might hear it as radioactive dating. Okay, so it's based on the radioactive decay. So pretty much when an organism dies, it stops taking in CO2, right? Okay, it stops with the carbon cycle. So there's two different kinds. So if we look, carbon dating, okay, there's two different forms of carbon. We have C12 and C14. Okay, C14 decays, but C12 does not. So for every 5,700 years, half of C14 in dead organisms decay. So this is why we call it a half-life. Okay, so basically we take the ratio between C12 and C14 and the time of death, and we compare it in the fossil. Okay, and this gives you an approximate time of the organism's life. Okay, so for example, you have a fossil, it's tested for C14. Okay, we find that 25%, or there's two half-lives of C14 when it was alive. So the half-life is 5,700 years. Okay, but the C14 went through two half-lives because since a half-life is 5,700, the fossil must be double that. Okay, so 11,400 years old. So you can always remember this. Let's try another one. Okay. So if we look, a fossil is found with 12.5% of the original amount of C14. So how old is the fossil? So if one half-life is 50% of C14, two half-lives is 25, then three half-lives must be 12.5%. So again, if the half-life is 5,700, how old is the fossil? It should be 17,100 years old. So basically we take 5,700 and we times it by 3. So before we get into the theory behind evolution, okay, I want to compare your carbon dating or your relative dating versus your absolute dating. Okay, so absolute dating versus relative dating. So how you can remember the differences: relative dating, if say in this room, unfortunately, everybody perished, and the building, million years later, an archaeologist digs us up. Okay, they will notice that the majority of you guys, the range or the relative dating, because the majority of you guys are the same age, could be anywhere from 14 to say 16. But for my case, they know that if they compare my fossils compared to your fossils, they'll notice that my relative dating is a little bit more compared to yours. Now, absolute dating is I can say that yes, this person right here, this fossil is 15 years old by 15 years old, 6 months, 2 weeks, 3 days, 17 hours, 30 minutes, and 21 seconds. Okay, that is its absolute age. Now let's talk about the different scientists. Okay, so catastrophicism. Curie actually came up with this. He was a French scientist, and we actually consider him one of the top pioneers of paleontology. Okay, so he noticed that two very, very important observations. Okay, so he looked at a younger fossil from an upper layer of rock, and it resembled some modern species. Okay, so he noticed that there were some differences between the fossil and the modern species to actually make them similar, but he noticed that they were definitely separate species. Okay, so some fossils that we know of, the mastodon. What is our modern organism that we notice that it's relative? The elephant. Okay, so again, there were some large mammals, but there was nothing that was quite alive at that point. Okay, what about the Irish elk? Or this is actually, if you've ever seen the movie Ice Age, this is Sid. Okay, this is the sloth. So we know that our modern day sloths are not this quite big. Okay, so he didn't coin these terms, but he did notice that there are two different types of evolutionary processes. Okay, there's extinction, where it's completely disappeared from Earth, and then he noticed an immersion of new species called speciation. Okay, so he noticed that the extinction of these huge vertebrates, like the giant sloth, okay, must have been due to a natural disaster that wiped them out. Okay, so this was the idea of catastrophism. Okay, so some scientists actually linked it to like the flood in the Bible or the Ice Age. So let's talk about evolution. Okay, so here's my first question that I want to ask you. How did the giraffe get its neck so long? And why are there 9 subspecies of giraffe? Well, it's due to these evidences, okay? So evidences of, again, this is a theory, okay? But we do have evidence to back up this theory. So we have the fossil record, we have anatomy, embryology, biogeographic, and molecular biology. Okay, so let's talk about the fossil record. So we've already talked a little bit about the fossil record. So again, it traces the history of life. Okay, so it shows transitional fossils. So if we look at this dinosaur, we do know that most dinosaurs actually came or more similarly related not to reptiles or lizards, but actually to birds. So we also notice that we, the hominid species, or Homo sapien, we have evolved by looking at different skull structures that we have found for the fossils. So again, we talked about that transitional species. So it's basically, it shows a link between our ancestors and our modern organisms. Like our original horse actually looked similar, or our ancestor of a horse actually looked similar to more like a deer than anything. So our second evidence is anatomy. Okay, so you have homologous structures, which we've talked about. Homo means same. Okay, so these are similar structures that you inherited from a common ancestor. So our bones in our arm, the horse's leg, the cat leg, and the whale flipper actually have the same bones. So this must mean that we all came from a common ancestor. Okay, so another structure, not a homologous structure, is called a vestigial structure. So basically, this whale actually has a pelvis bone, okay, which is a hip bone. Now, why would a whale need a hip bone? It has a flipper, it doesn't walk. Well, this actually, they still have a pelvis bone or a hip bone still to this day, but this means it doesn't serve any purpose, but it means that there was once in its ancestral population that it did have that purpose. So at one point, whales actually had legs that they needed to walk with, but now it's vestigial. Can you name any other vestigial structures that we have that we don't really use? What about your wisdom teeth? What about your appendix? Okay. So another reason why the fossil record is very important is because it actually, again, that's why we have this vestigial structure. We do see that whales actually evolved from land animals. Okay, and land animals, land tetrapods. Okay, so 4 limbs, they do have a vestigial pelvis bone or a hip bone. So in humans, the palmus longus muscle is actually vestigial. Okay, so if you can put your thumb and your thumb and your pinky together, and you see this muscle, okay, present, it's actually vestigial. Some people don't have it, or if you actually have a hole atop your ear, that was actually one of your gill slits when you were in the womb. So the next evidence is embryology. Okay, so embryology is the study of embryos or babies. Okay, so we know that all vertebrates have the same basic pattern of development. So if we look, we have a human, we have a chicken, we have a tortoise, we have a salamander, we have a fish. So if you notice the very first column, can you tell the difference between any of those? Nope. Okay, but the last column, the third column, can you see that, yeah, this is definitely, you can see that there's a fish at the top, salamander second, turtle or tortoise third, the chicken with the beak, and then a baby. Okay, so at one point, all vertebrates actually looked very similar. They have biogeographic. So geographic means where they're located. So you would not be able to see them. These Australian mammals would not be able to survive in, say, the United States. So the last evidence is molecular evidence. So this is the most specific, or the most this is the best way that we can actually determine or support this theory. So basically, the more similar genes you have, the closer you're related. So between a human and a chimp, we actually share very similar genes. We share about 98% of our genes with a chimp. But on the other hand, you share 18% with plants. You share 92 with a mouse, 44 with a fly, and 26 with a microorganism called a yeast. Now, there are some myths, okay? So remember, evolution is just a theory, okay? So individuals evolve. That's not true, okay? So evolution explains the origin of life. That's not true. And organisms evolve on purpose, or it's directional. Not so much, okay? So again, we just can't decide that we want to evolve. So what is an evidence that shows when organisms live on the earth? Fossil evidence. Okay, species that are closely related will have similar what? Ancestors. A blank organ is one that has no function. Okay, so a vestigial organ. A blank structure looks the same but has different functions. So like our arm compared to a whale's flipper. So again, we have the same structure, but we can't go swimming and live in an aquatic environment. So what's number 4? Homologous. What about number 5? Blank of different animals develop in the same way. So embryology. So your science doesn't know it at all. True, but it has evidence to support it, to support everything it claims to know. Okay, so again, this is a theory, okay, but we do have evidence to back us up. So another theory that we have is gradualism. Okay, so Lyell actually disagreed with Cuvier about his catastrophism. Okay, so he favored unitarism. Okay, which basically means that Earth kind of slowly transformed, okay, through tiny little changes. So we do know that to this day we do have erosion. Okay, erosion is any movement of sediment by wind or water. We do see that. Okay, we also see a rise and fall in the ocean levels that we're experiencing right now. We see volcanoes erupt and earthquakes happen. Okay, so we had another scientist, Lamarck. Okay, so Lamarck actually, his theory was acquired traits or acquired characteristics. So unitarianism basically supported scientists that were seeking to explain adaptations or a variety or variation between living organisms that helped them survive. So Lamarck actually hypothesized that these animals would actually adapt to their environments by basically changing their muscles or their organisms over time due to either using it or disusing it. So basically, some thought that if you would gain or lose basically features if you overused it or didn't use them at all. So these acquired traits would actually then be passed down to the next generation. Well, here's the thing. He saw it in giraffes. So he said if a giraffe was born with a short neck, over time it would actually use its neck in order to get the really tall leaves at the top, and eventually it would actually be able to grow a long neck, and then it would pass down that long neck trait down to its young, which we know not correct. Okay, you just can't decide that you're going to be 6 foot and just be 6 foot, and then all of your family members are going to be 6 foot. Or he also stated that basically if you got into a car accident and your right arm you had to be amputated, that means that all of your kids are going to have no right arm. Not going to happen. Okay, so how our next scientist was actually Darwin. Okay, Darwin was a 22-year-old naturalist, which basically went aboard the HMS Beagle. Okay, and he traveled around the world. So he actually made observations of animals and organisms that he inhabited, particular islands. Okay, so he actually studied geographic, which basically he looked at tortoises, he looked at iguanas, and inches. So this is just a map that shows you where the HMS Beagle ventured. So mainly adventured through the southern hemisphere. So he wrote a book called The Origin of Species. Okay, so he established adaptive radiation. Okay, so in his book, he actually looked at some familiar examples. Okay, artificial selection. We talked about that with genetics. So what is artificial selection? It's where we as humans actually get to select. Okay, you might hear it as selective breeding. Get to select the best trait out of organisms. So like dog breeding or horse breeding. Okay, so again, all dogs, okay, all breeds of dogs descended from what? What was their original ancestor? The wolf. Okay, but now we know, look at all of these different types of dogs. Okay, so from one wolf, you have a German Shepherd, you have a Lab, you have a Poodle, you have a Shih Tzu, you have a Great Dane. All of them came from one ancestor, okay, because we have actually selected their trait due to size or color, or temperate, okay, so we've artificially selected them. So we also not just artificially selected animals, we've also done it in plants. Okay, so cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and a lot of other vegetation or in vegetables were actually from a single plant. Okay, wild mustard. So if we look, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, they're all from wild mushroom. Okay, so Darwin actually looked at 3 different types of observation, which gave him a very important inference that organisms will compete with others for access to resources. So there's 2 different kinds. There's interspecific, which that means that the same species will compete, and then there's intraspecific, that means that they will compete with other species. Okay. The next observation was that all species were able to reproduce. Okay, so you had to be able, in order to be considered a species, you have to be able to reproduce, and you have to be able to actually have fertile offsprings. So the second observation is population numbers tend to be pretty stable. Okay, so how does this reconcile with super fecundity? Remember, fecundity is how you reproduce. Okay, so again, they have to tend to be stable. So again, your birth rates and your death rates have to be more than your death rates. So the third observation is there are limited resources. Okay, so in that given area. So remember, resources can be food, water, shelter, even a mate. Okay, so the fourth observation is that he noticed that a lot of the population, or the individuals in that population, they had a lot of different traits. So if we look at this Asian lady beetle, okay, they're all lady beetles, but they all are different, have different spots and different colorizations. So the fifth observation is that plants and animals, they possess or have different differences in their trait based on what individual passed down to them. So what you got from your parent. So his theory was actually the theory of natural selection. Okay, so he looked at, when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he looked at mainland finches. Okay, so he noticed that the finches actually had a variety in nesting sites, beak size, their feet. Okay, and he noticed that the other island birds, other finches, actually were descendants from the mainland species. So what this idea is actually called common descent. So again, Darwin and Wallace also had similar ideas about how species changed over time, which is due to natural selection. So he noticed that characteristics of variations were inherited. He noticed that more offsprings were produced than could survive, and they also noticed that those with the most favorable characteristics did survive, aka they adapted. So Darwin traveled to which islands? The Galapagos Islands. What was his name of his ship? HMS Beagle. So there were 4 species he observed on the island. Okay, it was the finches, the turtles or tortoises, the iguanas, and then also a plant species. He developed what theory? Natural selection. This theory explains how organisms adapt. Okay, so do individuals evolve or do populations evolve? Okay, so populations evolve over time. So let's talk about his common descent, or his descent with modification. Okay, so each generation will have more individuals with those traits in the previous generation, which we know. Okay, so we know that you're not going to have the ancestor of the horse look like the modern day horse. Okay, so the horses are going to look like the modern day horses, not like their ancestors. All right, so taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of classifying organisms. So Carl Linnaeus was the one that developed, he is the father of taxonomy, just like Darwin is the father of evolution. And he noticed, or he developed, a binomen nomenclature, which means two-part naming system. Okay, so he discovered, or he developed, genus versus species. Okay, so every single organism that walks planet Earth or is on planet Earth has a genus and a species name. We even have a genus and species name. So ours is Homo, which is our genus, and Sapien is our species. You'll notice that the genus is always capitalized and the species is always lowercase. Okay, so even though you might have 3 different types of giraffe, guess what? They all have a genus, and they all have a species. So here's 2 other different types of giraffe. Remember how we said that there are 9 subspecies of giraffe? Well, some of them have 3 names. Well, guess what? Giraffea is, for both of them, that is their genus, okay? And the last 2 names are their species name. So we talked about our evidence of biogeographic. Okay, so remember, this is the study of distributing, okay, or how species distribute in a space or time. Okay, so why are there so many different subspecies, and why are they in distinct locations? Okay, so again, all of these giraffes were descended from one common ancestor. Okay, so how does natural selection explain the finches of the Galapagos Island? So I want you to watch this video. So remember how we talked about the factors that will encourage or basically promote things, or favor basically certain individuals in a population. Okay, so there's physiological stress, okay, which is like moisture, light, pH. There's predation, which is you're either hunted or killed by another. Competition, which can be, remember, intra or inter, right? Intra within different species, inter within the same. Or sexual selection, okay? So this is basically the female is actually responding to behaviors. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, so predation. Okay, so predation is basically where it will encourage, okay, selection of individuals, okay, with a trait depending on if they can defend against or even evade those predators. So the porcupine, what is its adaptation? So competition, okay, so remember, if basically natural selection is another name for survival of the fittest. Okay, so if you're weaker or less fit, okay, so less fit doesn't mean you're not strong, okay? It just means that genetically you have that adaptation, okay? So the less fit the less fit individual will not survive, and the fittest will survive, and then they will actually pass down their traits. Okay, so again, the ibexes, okay, they compete for the female's attention. Okay, so males will fight over the access to males. Okay, sexual selection. This is he's kind of struggled to really understand why birds would produce brightly colored males. And so he actually once said that the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail actually makes me sick. Okay, so the male birds are able to grow these really colorful and long trains because they must be healthy. So thus they must be a suitable mate. And the female birds actually are very dull in colorization. And that's pretty much through all the bird species. Okay, so the female actually gets to choose. The male does not actually get to choose its mate. Physiological stresses, there are some environmental factors that will either help a population grow or decline. Okay, so there is an optimal range for this factor. So there is a zone of stress that's okay. But again, if you're weak or less adapted, you are going to basically be selected out, okay, or you're not going to be able to survive. And that is where the zone of intolerance comes in, where the population's just going to die out. And again, this could be moisture or pH or even just too much sunlight. So the type of adaptation, okay, so there's physical adaptation, which is, colorization, body shape, muscular, types. There's behavioral, such as migration or even marking your territory like dog. Physiological is like skin tanning, okay, so this is more towards the cellular level. Okay, so the gorilla is physically adapted for living and feeding on the ground, while the chimps gather food from the trees. Okay, so how they walk and how they behave. Okay, so behaving is trees versus the ground, and physical structure. Okay, so the gorillas are much stronger than the chimps are. So let's look at the definition of evolution. So again, evolution is a change in allele frequency, or a change in the gene pool of a population. Okay, so we don't need to see an animal actually physically change, because we can actually measure it through the cellular level or the DNA level. So some very important factors, or important key things that you need to remember, is individuals cannot evolve. Okay, they either live or they die. A population will evolve, not individuals. Okay, so the second important thing is evolution does not have a direction. Okay, organisms aren't trying to be anything that they are. They're just trying to survive and reproduce. Now, the last one is fitness. Okay, so fitness refers to the organism's ability to survive. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean stronger physically. Okay, so again, individuals differ in fitness. Okay, relative fitness. So again, this is not necessarily stronger. This just means if you are going to survive, okay, and you're going to reproduce successfully. So melanism is actually where it's a darkening of the skin pigment, okay, due to melanin, which is the pigment color that you have. Okay, so even you have that. So that's why there's some variation between animals. So the Black Panther, which is up top, actually is the same as the jaguar, which is below. So this is selection strength. So how strong does the environment push the survival or limitation, okay, of polymorphism? So poly means many and morphism means to morph, okay? So some examples are the clover or the rock pocket mice. So basically they actually had to change their appearance in order to survive, okay, due to the climate or due to melanin. Okay, remember how we talked about melanin when we talked about the jaguars and the panthers? They're actually the same organism, but they had to. So divergent versus convergent evolution. Okay, so again, these are divergent. You actually have one ancestor and you diverge, or you split into many different species. Now convergent means that, like the shark and the dolphin, they both have a dorsal fin, but they are not related. Okay, so the phenotypes are similar, but they're not related. So a dolphin is a mammal and a shark is a fish, but they do have similar characteristics. Now let's talk about evolutionary scales. So you have macro evolution, which is basically, macro means big, so it's a long time scale that created or destroyed a species. So we're talking about like the mammoths. Okay, it took a long time. Now, micro, on the other hand, this is a short time scale. Okay, so this is more like generation. So this is where your genotypes and your phenotypes of a population will change. So today we know that causes individual differences in alleles, okay, such as random mutations. So this is a picture of the peppered moth. Okay, so basically what happened was, in the Industrial Revolution, what did we have? We had a lot of pollution, and that pollution caused their habitat, which originally were white trees, and they so the peppered or the lighter colored moss actually survived because they were camouflaged, and the recessive trait or the darker moth perished because it was easier for them to be detected. Well, when the Industrial Revolution happened, the trees then were covered with soot, and so those dominant genes of being a white peppered moth, they were not able to be camouflaged as well as the recessive trait of the dark moth. So what happened was because of this change in their environment, they had to adapt or to morph to better survive. So let's do a little review. Okay, so you have a variation, which is polymorphism, which means that you have many forms of one individual, so it's a variety. Relative fitness is basically who survives selection. Okay, so individuals will compete for resources, and eventually competition would lead to death of some. Okay, so again, survival of the fittest. So the last one is reproduction. Okay, so remember, individuals that have an advantage of variation, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So again, as an organism, you want to reproduce, you want to be able to survive. So let's do a checkpoint. What was Darwin's book called? Origin of Species. So what did his theory state? An individual of a species have differences called mutations. These individuals blank for resources, compete. Some will die, others will survive. Survivors will then reproduce and pass traits to their offsprings. Any trait that helps an organism survive is called an adaptation. When humans influence evolution for breeding, okay, we were going to breed a desired trait. What is that? That's either selective breeding or artificial selection. Okay, so I don't believe in evolution. Rather, I accept the overwhelming scientific evidence that supports this theory. Again, so it's all about the evidence. Okay, this is why it's a theory. So if we actually change or we get new evidences, guess what? The theory will change. That's the difference between a theory and a law. So let's talk about speciation, okay, or forming new species. So what exactly is a species? So a species is an individual organism that can interbreed and reproduce, okay, and produce fertile offspring. So that is the key. They have to be able to produce fertile offsprings. So a hybrid, we talked about hybrid. Hybrid is basically a cross between two species. Most of the time, they produce infertile offspring. So like our liger is a combination between a lion and a tiger. Our zonkey is a combination between a zebra and a donkey. Okay, so there are organisms that just can't reproduce. So for example, a mule. A mule is a combination between a donkey and a horse. Okay, you cannot, in order to reproduce or in order to make more mules, you have to have that combination of a horse and a donkey. Okay, you can't take a mule and mate them and they produce a mule. It won't happen. Okay, so speciation is the formation of two species from one original species. Okay, so like our house cat. Okay, so our house cat. Now we know there are many different types of house cats that are available, but they all came from one ancestor. So we've got two different kinds of speciations. Okay, we have sympatric and allopatric. Okay, so allopatric is other homeland. So if you notice, it's all dealing with biogeographic. Okay, so we have this lizard here, or this basically this salamander, excuse me. And if you notice, the original species actually started in the north and migrated southward. So when the population split east to west due to the valley, okay, you had an evolution, or you had a differences between a western population and an eastern population. They split into two different species. Okay, sympatric means same homeland. So this is the cichlid. You have a flat cichlid, a thin-lipped cichlid, and a thick-lipped cichlid. Okay, so again, they actually had a mutation based on their lips. Okay, so what kind of speciation is this, where you have a eastern versus a western? This is allopatric. Okay, adaptive radiation is basically every single one of these organisms came from one common ancestor. Okay, so one ancestor branched into many. Okay, this is divergent evolution, and each of them occupy their own niche. Do you remember what a niche is? It's their job. Okay, so each of these niches have, or each of these finches have different niches. So reproductive isolation. Okay, basically it prevents a species to interbreed. Okay, there's a couple different barriers. There's pre-zygotic. Okay, that means that there's some kind of blockage that's taking place. Okay, so this could be mechanical or gamete barriers. Okay, so that means, for example, if you look at this damselfly's penis, okay, it's actually curved. So if you notice, this is either an anatomy problem, or either just their eggs and sperm just don't work. Okay, so pre-zygotic barriers could be temporal. Okay, that means that they breed during different times. It could be just habitat. They just can't get to them because they live in two different places. Or behavioral. So for example, like mating or courtship behaviors. So post-zygotic is meaning that the eggs and sperm produce offsprings that just don't survive. Okay, so remember how we talked about a species has to be able to interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. So you've got a mule. A mule is sterile. Okay, you have to have a donkey and a horse in order to produce a mule. Okay, a mule and a mule cannot mate to produce another mule. So we have the rate of speciation. Okay, so we have gradual versus punctual equilibrium. Okay, if something is gradual, it's very, very slow change. Okay, in small steps. Okay, it is a very gradual change. And for this example, in their beak sizes. Okay, so it's not like you're going to have a small beak and then just have this 4 feet beak all of a sudden. Okay, it's a gradual small step. Now, punctuated equilibrium. This means that it's rapid change due to some kind of environmental disruption. Okay, something happened. So, for example, this is a micro evolution. Okay, so when we talked about the peppered moss, okay, so industrial revolution took not many years. It just took a couple years for the habitat to change. Okay, so this is a quick little video that I want you to take a shot at. So is a hybrid grizzly polar bear a Pizzly or a granola bear? Okay, so this is just to kind of show you over time. Okay, so reinforcement, hybrids are less fit than either purebred species. Okay, so the species are going to continue to diverge, okay, or separate until hybridization actually can't happen anymore. So fission is when there's barriers are weakened and those two species become one. And stable is when it fits the hybrids continues. Okay, they just continuously reproduce over time. Okay, so a little quick review of Mendelian genetics. Okay, so big B is a brown mice. Big B is a brown mice, but it's heterozygous. Remember, it's different. And little b is a beige mice, or it's recessive. Okay, so what happens when you cross big B with a little b? What's the babies? All of them are going to be big B, little b. What happens when you have big B crossed with big B? Or excuse me, little b. You're going to have 75% heterozygous and 25% recessive. Okay, what about big B, or big B, little b times big B, little b? You're going to have 50-50. Songbird principle states that basically we noticed that there was a frequency of different alleles. Okay, so it just basically, this frequency kind of remained constant unless there was some kind of factors. Okay, so some kind of problem that could be a limitation of resources, it could be an environmental issue, it could be any of the following. Okay, so basically it's going to continue this way. Now, it shows kind of, it's only possible if there's a microevolution, okay, it's only possible if all the mechanisms that cause micro are not present, okay, so we're talking about a macro evolution, not micro, okay, populations must be very large, there can't be any movement, so there's no gene flow, okay, there's no migration, okay, between populations, no mutations can occur. Mating must be completely random. Okay, there cannot be any selection whatsoever. Okay, so it just has to be a luck of the draw. the alleles must not affect change of survival and reproduction. Okay, so they you can't have survival of the fittest. Okay, so pretty much it's pretty rare to actually see all of these conditions met. So the alleles and the genotype frequencies are almost always changing. Okay, so this is kind of a utopia or an idealistic process. Okay, so most of the time in the real world, you're not going to see this. Okay, so again, this is no selection, no mutation, no migration. It's got to be large and it's got to be random. Okay, it's pretty slim pickings. Okay. So this is our formula that we have to use. Okay, so p squared plus plus 2 times p times q plus q squared equals 1. Okay, so p is your homozygous dominant, okay, because you have big B, plus your 2 heterozygous dominant, big B, little b, plus your 2 recessive or homozygous recessive. Okay, so basically it's the homozygous dominant with your heterozygous dominant with your homozygous recessive. Okay, so for example, we're going to look at about 90,000 out of 5.4 million births in Nigeria happened in 88. Okay, they had a rare disease called sickle cell. So what was the percentages of the carriers? Okay, so this is our following. So basically all we have to do is we have to calculate for Q squared. Okay, so next we're going to solve for Q. And what we get is basically 13% of the alleles were sickle cell anemia. Okay, so again, if Q is 13%, then P must be 87%. Okay, so we can then use the equation to kind of figure out the frequency. So if we plug and chug, we get that the homozygous dominant, or the normal, there was 75%. The heterozygous, which are the carriers, were almost 23%. And the homozygous recessive was about 1.7%. Okay, so a little recap for you. So changes to an allele frequency, okay, occurs, or within a gene pool, okay, has to have these 5 processes. Okay, so you have to have a mutation, gene flow, which is movement, sexual reproduction, okay, it's got to alter, a genetic drift. Okay, so we talked about genetic drift. This is the change in the gene pool based on off a chance. Okay, so and again, natural selection, the gene pool is a result of selective environmental pressures. Okay, so again, that's these limiting factors. So take a couple minutes and watch this video. Now gene flow. We talked about gene flow already. Gene flow is basically a movement of alleles, migration. Okay, this can prevent speciation to occur, but it does increase variation. Now, sexual reproduction. This definitely increases variation. Okay, so when we're talking about non-random mating, okay, we're talking about actual selection. This actually decreases diversity. Okay, so if you look. Okay, so random mating, doesn't matter who you are, we're going to mate. Non-random mating means that you are going to choose a particular mate. Well, if we always choose the best one, those recessive traits are never going to be able to survive. So genetic drift, okay, this refers to mainly in a small population, and most of the time the individuals do die just by random chance. Okay, so this is just another example for you. Now the bottleneck effect. Okay, so basically this is where it's a form of genetic drift that actually reduces the population. So pretty much the population that regrows has less diversity. Okay, so if we take our parent population, we bottleneck it. Okay, we only select. Okay, there's a couple reductions in the population. If you look, there's not a lot of survival. Okay, so your next generation, because there's not a lot of individuals, there's not a lot of diversity, there's not a lot of variation, you're going to have pretty much the same type of individuals per the next generation. Now the founder's effect. This is basically where a few individuals have to start a new population. So for example, the Amish actually have dwarfism in their community, okay, because they have a few German founders. Okay, so most of the Amish only recreate or reproduce with just Amish. So that gene pool is extremely small, okay? And that's where your higher chance of having mutations occur. So mutation versus gene flow versus genetic drift versus natural selection. So again, let's talk about types of selection. Okay, so we've got variation, competition, adaptation, and selection. Okay, so adaptive evolution. Okay, so remember, this is where we have one general or one founder, okay, or one ancestor, and we're going to diverge. Okay, so the types of selection, you have directional. Okay, basically what that means is one phenotype is favored over the other. This does sometimes cause a shift. Okay, so if you notice, the favoring phenotype was for the ancestral horse was to be very small. Then it shifted to a medium size, and then eventually we shifted to a large size. Okay, stabilizing selection, this is basically where you have the two extremes are kind of eliminated and that medium or that happy middle phenotype is favored. Now, human babies basically have an average, okay, so we're stable, right? Okay, so too big, they can't get through the birth canal, too small, and they don't survive. So you have a happy medium, okay, of size. So this would be a stabilizing selection. Now, disruptive means that the two extremes actually are favored over the middle. Okay, this can actually lead to speciation. So, gentlemen, what if anything would change your mind? Evidence, nothing. So let's talk about classification. Okay, so this is Hercules. This is a 922-pound liger. Okay, this is the largest living cat. So what is Hercules? Hercules is a hybrid. So again, what is a species? Okay, it's the smallest classification order, and it's where any two individuals within that same species are able to reproduce, and they have to have a fertile offspring. Okay, so there's estimated about 8.7 million different types of species. Okay, but again, each of them evolved from a common ancestor. So again, we talked about reproductive isolation, okay, which means that different species just can't mate, okay? So this prevents this exchange, and this is what we refer to as genetic flow, okay? So we talked about pre-zygotic barriers, okay? So this is, again, this is something prior. This might be a prevention of the eggs or just mating in general, okay? So we have habitat isolation, temporal, behavioral isolation, mechanical, and gamete. Okay, post, again, this is an effect of the fertility of the hybrid. Okay, this is after fertilization. So again, let's talk about habitat. Okay, so polar bears, we know they live in the Arctic Circle. Okay, and they had to basically evolve. Okay, they had to change their fur to white, okay, to better adapt themselves. So brown bears live just below the Arctic Circle. Okay, in rare occasions they do reproduce and they produce hybrid in captivity. Okay, so this is habitat isolation. Basically, they just don't live in the same area. Now, another one is timing or temporal isolation. Okay, so most species, they might share the same habitat, but again, they mate during different seasons. So the American toad versus the Fowler toad, they live in the same habitat, but they do not mate during the same year. This actually is timing. Okay, so timing isolation has this. Now, behavioral is what we see mainly in birds. Okay, birds are pretty interesting. They do have the most diverse mating or behavioral isolation that you can see. So some of them dance, some of them sing, some of them build nests, some of them do all of them. Okay, but again, this is to actually signal of these signals don't attract other birds. Okay, they only attract the bird that they are trying to mate with. Now, in some, their female and male sex organs actually physically just cannot work with. They're not compatible with other species. So this is a mechanical isolation. So even if they tried to mate with another species, physically and their anatomy just wouldn't work. Okay, so the mallard duck actually has a corkscrew penis and a vagina. Okay, so again, if a mallard duck tried to mate, say, with a penguin, it physically, the two parts would not actually connect. Now, in some, the eggs and sperm, they come in contact, but they're just not able to be even fertilized. Okay, this is for your gametes. Okay, so your gametes will not actually physically fuse. Okay, so like for example, even though the purple anemone the purple urchin and the red urchin, they might have their gametes externally. Even if they tried to combine, their eggs and sperm would actually not fuse together. So post, okay, so again, this is something after. This is some type of barrier that just the hybrids basically would not be able to survive. So this is a post thing. So this is more of the hybrids not physically being able. They're not physically being able to because they're still. Okay, so we talked about speciation. Okay, so remember we talked about punctuated equilibrium. Was that gradual change, or was that a short amount of time and then they changed? Okay, so basically this is long periods of balance or equilibrium, and then all of a sudden there's some type of abrupt change. Okay, so this is some type of speciation or split or even extinction. Okay, so gradualism, we notice that most fossils actually show a gradual change over time. Okay, so this is not a long period of stable, and then there was some type of change like the pepper moss. Okay, taxonomy. Why? Taxonomy is the study of classification, okay, or how we classify things. So you have biological species concept, which is basically how species are separated based on how they reproduce and have fertile offsprings, and then classification is more of the morphology or the shape or the size. The last one, or the most specific way that we can actually compare organisms, is the phylogical. Okay, so if we look at this map, okay, we have a lot of biodiversity, okay, or there's been a lot of change. And in order to figure out all of these different species, remember, we're talking about 3.6 billion years of small mutations in natural selection occurring, okay? So we have to be able to identify and classify the rest of these guys, and it's a pretty big challenge. Okay, so why do we need to classify? So imagine you're at the grocery store. How's it organized? Is it organized by cereals versus paper towels versus how is it organized? How's your drawer in your bedroom organized? How are your songs on your iTunes account? Or is it by playlist? Is it by genre? Is it by song title? Is it by artist? And imagine the layout of the zoo. How's it organized? Okay, so we have to basically use classification in order to organize. Okay, so we do this even when we go on websites. Okay, so websites are even organized based on classification systems. So if we go on Amazon, you want to find a video game. Okay, you're not going to search through all of the departments. You're going to go straight to electronics and straight to video games. Now let's look. Which one is a sea lion versus an ant lion versus a lion? So the top one is a sea lion. The one to the right is an ant lion, and the one to the bottom is our lion. Well, what kind of organism is this? Okay, so is a sea monkey an invertebrate, a mammal, an insect, a fish, or a reptile? Well, a sea monkey is actually an invertebrate. What about a firefly? Insect. What about ringworm? Ooh, that one's a tricky one. That's actually a fungus. What about a jellyfish? That's an invertebrate. What about a spider monkey? That's a mammal. What about a crawfish? That is actually a part of an insect or an arthropod. But what about a seahorse? Seahorses are actually classified as a fish. Okay, so consider this. Are all gray wolves gray? Are all black bears black? Which one's more venomous, a water moccasin or a cottonmouth? Well, guess what? All gray wolves are not gray. They can actually be white, black, or any shade of gray. Black bears can also be brown or gray. And a cottonmouth and a water moccasin are exactly the same thing. Okay, their names just kind of vary by region. So it's a little bit difficult when we're talking about these common names. So this is why we have to classify. So the classification system, or the system that Carl Linnaeus actually created, okay, he used Greek and Latin names. Now, why did he use that instead of like English or Spanish? Well, it's because all languages come from Latin. Okay, so we looked at, basically we have these different kingdoms. Okay, so we have a few large groups. So we have Protista, Eubacteria, Archaeobacteria, fungi, Animalia, and Plantae. Okay, but before that, okay, so kingdoms. Before that, we actually have domains. Okay, so each group basically gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you get the more specific, or the actual organism that you're looking at. Okay, so you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, so how my little acronym that I use is Dr. King Philip came over for grape soup. Okay, or great spaghetti. Okay, so this is our panther, right? This is our jaguar. So we look, it's in the kingdom Animalia. Phylum Chordata means it has a spine. It's a mammal, that is the class. Its order is a carnivora, so it's a carnivore. Family is a feline. He's in the panther group, but he's actually a jaguar. Okay, so Pantherus pardus. So what are the specific names of each of these organisms? Okay, so the scientific name, you have two names. Okay, you have your genus name and you have your species name. So which one of these is actually closely related? Because they have the same genus name, the lion and the tiger. But if you notice, the species name for the tiger is Tigris, and for the lion, it's Leo. So that is what makes them different between a lion and a tiger. Now let's look at the classification of a timber rattlesnake. So which of these represents a diamondback rattlesnake? And how can you tell? Even though you might not know the domain through the family, you do know that the timber rattlesnake and the diamondback rattlesnake are both rattlesnakes. So they must share the same what? Genus name. So which one of these has the same genus name as the timber rattlesnake? It should be C. Let's talk about, remember how we said the genus versus species. Okay, this is referred to as binomen nomenclature, which basically just means you got two naming system. Okay, but there are some rules to it. The name has to be either underlined or italicized. So if you write it, it has to be underlined. If you type it, it has to be italicized. The other thing is your genus has to be capitalized. Your species cannot be anything but lowercase. So you can abbreviate. Okay, so if you don't want to write the full genus name, you can just put the capital letter in the first initial and then write out the species name in lowercase. So what exactly is species? Okay, so again, remember, it is an organism that can interbreed with another, but they have to produce fertile offspring. That is the key. Okay, but again, when two different species interbreed and they have an offspring, it's called a hybrid. Okay, so like liger moles. Now remember how I told you before the kingdoms, before the six kingdoms, there's 3 additional systems. This actually just happened within the past few years. So you have domain eukarya. Okay, this is everything that's a eukaryotic cell. So plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Now domain bacteria, there's only one kingdom. Okay, so this is all prokaryotic cells. Okay, so this is eubacteria is in this domain. Now our last domain is archaea. Okay, remember archaea means ancient. So we're talking about archaeobacteria, or ancient bacteria. So let's do a check. Okay, what is our 7 Linnaeus classification systems? So you have kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Remember, Dr. King Philip came over for grape soda, or great soup, or great spaghetti. Whatever you want to do, whatever acronym that you want to figure out. Okay, so number 2. Which 2 groups are used for an organism's scientific name? So out of those 7, which ones are used? Genus and species. Okay, which one of these are closely related, and how can you tell? Are you looking at the second name, which is the species, or are you looking at the first name, that's the genus? You're looking at the first name, that's the genus. So is it option A or option B? The first option. The system we use for naming is called binomial nomenclature. Okay, what is the science of classification called? Taxonomy. Okay, so how do we identify these organisms? Okay, we have no idea what this organism is. It just walks up in our backyard. Well, we use these things called field guides, which basically has a lot of pictures and it has some referencing organisms that you can compare to. Okay, so a taxonomy is key. This is extremely important. It's basically a step-by-step guide to help you identify. Okay, and it kind of follows a series of choices. Okay, and eventually it will lead you down to the organism. So anybody know what this thing is? It's got a terrapin. Okay, so here's our example. We have no idea what these 6 organisms are, but we actually we start with question 1, and it gives us two choices. So if we're looking at A, okay, we're trying to identify organism A. So we has green bodied or is purpled. Okay, so we know that this is green, so we go to number 2. Okay, so we go to question number 2. Has 4 legs, go to 3. Has 8 legs, that is your organism. So this only has 4, so we're going to go to number 3. Has a tail versus does not have a tail. So it does not have a tail, so our organism is Dirus magnus. Okay, or our genus is Dirus, and our species is Magnus. So let's talk a little bit more about our 6 kingdoms. Okay, so again, kingdoms are based on a couple of criteria. You've got the number of cells. Are you unicellular? Are you multicellular? How does it obtain energy? Are you heterotrophic or autotrophic? And what's your cells? Are you eukaryotic versus prokaryotic? Okay, so let's talk about what are these terms even mean. So heterotrophic means what again? You have to consume other things. What is autotrophic? You make your own food. What is unicellular? One cell. What's multicellular? Many cells. What is prokaryotic? Means you have no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. You're very small and very simple. What about eukaryotic? It's all the opposite. You do have a nucleus. You do have membrane-bound organelles. You're very large and very complex. Well, what are about some non-science words like famished? Okay, that means that you are starved. What about mobile or motile? That means that you're able to move. Okay, so what kind of organisms are each in this kingdoms? What I want you to do is I want you to create this chart, okay, and we're going to go through each slide, and I want you to be able to fill out the requirements. This is going to go on your page 3. So let's talk about animals first. Okay, so it's multicellular, they're eukaryotic, they're heterotrophic. Most of them can move. Okay, some examples are birds, insects, worms, mammals, reptiles, humans, and anemones. All right, what about kingdom Plantae? Okay, they're multicellular, eukaryotic, autotrophic, and they cannot move due to their cell walls. So this is plants. You can say corn, you can say tulips, you can say cacti, whatever you want. And I'll give you 30 seconds to fill out your chart. Our next group is fungi. So they're multicellular, most of them. They're eukaryotic, they're heterotrophic, and some examples might be mushrooms. It could also be yeast. It could also be truffles or any type of decomposer. "30 seconds to fill out your chart. All right, so the last two, eubacteria, you are unicellular. You can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. You're prokaryotic, which means you don't have a nucleus. And some examples could be Salmonella or E. coli. Now, basically, archaea is the same thing, but archaea are ancient bacteria. So they exist in very extreme environments. Okay, so this is like a methogen or a halogen. Okay, so this is kind of pretty funny. This is cat found. Okay, it's male, no collar, not very friendly, but I think he might be scared. Not housebroken either. Found on this boulevard. If he's yours, please call. Okay, why is this a taxonomy fail? Is this actually a cat? No, it is a possum. Okay, so this is not a great way of using your taxonomy skills. So clades. Okay, so this is just basically a really fancy name for a group. Now, when we looked at the phylology, which is basically how we study the evolutionary differences, okay, or relationships. So how would you classify a hyena? Would you group it as a cat or a dog? And how could you tell? So a clade, again, remember this includes the single common ancestor and all of its descendants, okay? So a cladogram, which you guys are going to create, basically shows how clades, what a clade is and basically how they're linked or grouped. So derived characters. These are traits that arose in a common ancestor that every single one of those descendants share. Okay, so if we looked at lungs, every single one of those organisms have lungs. Okay, the lungfish, the frog, the mammal, the turtle, the snakes, crocodiles, birds, all of them have lungs. But if we look at the holes in the skull below the eye socket, okay, it starts with your turtles, your snakes, your crocodiles, and your birds. Do mammals have that? Nope. Do frogs have that? Nope. Do lungfish have that? Nope. Okay, so it only is from that point on. Okay, this is another example. So every single one of these organisms, starting with the bluegill, okay, have bony skeletons, but the shark and the clam, they do not. So they do not possess that derived character. So I want you to watch this animation on how a cladogram is actually built, okay, because you're going to do a lab on this. So again, this is another one. So how you have each of these and how are they divided, okay? So we start with the ancestral protists, okay? So we only have a couple, we have ones that do not possess it, which is our sponges, and then we have the ones that do. Okay, so this is phylology. This is basically how we something. Okay, and here's another example that I want you to look at. Okay, so all of these have cuticles, and if you look, okay, chitin in the exoskeleton is another derived character, and then eventually our even more specific derived character is jointed appendages. Now, let's check for understanding. A diagram that shows the evolutionary relationship is, okay, this is called a cladogram. Okay, a characteristic that appears only in the recent is called a derived. Okay, what's the study of evolutionary relationships called? This is called the modern evolution or phylology. What's the system to find the names of unknown organisms is called what kind of key? Dichotomous.